It's like a joint.
Welcome, everyone. We'll let people trickle in because I guess unless we start, nobody will come in, it sounds like. So my name is Sampath Kannan. I'm the Associate Director at the Simons Institute, and I wanted to welcome you all on behalf of the Institute. Many of you have heard this before, but for the few who haven't, who's their first workshop in a long time, the Simons Institute was funded by a generous grant from the Simons Foundation in 2012. We've been going strong for more than a decade, and we expect to go on for much longer, at least another decade and longer. Simons Institute brings together researchers in theoretical computer science, the top researchers in a particular area from all over the world, and young talent as well. We have a lot of fellows and senior graduate students who will go on to have great careers after the visit here. It's a unique institution of its kind in computer science. There are no places, other places in computer science that bring together researchers to collaborate for a whole semester at a time. So we have small institutes that do workshops and so on, but the Simons is pretty unique. Of course, this group is about cryptography, so it's a core area of computer science. But we also specialize in taking algorithmic lens, a theoretical lens, on other areas of inquiry, like economics and physics and mathematics, and lately even psychology, linguistics, and the connections to AI and so on, hoping to expand the frontiers of theory and areas in which theory can have an impact. So I welcome you all to this very thriving program and third workshop in the program on secure computation, a core area in cryptography. Thanks to the organizers, Elet, Sanjam, and Mike. I'm going to hand off to Elet in a minute, but one brief housekeeping remark. As I see very well here, we do not permit food or drink in the auditorium, except for water. If you did bring in some food, that's okay this time, but please don't bring that in the future. Okay.
All right, welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to open up the Secure Computation workshop. We have a full program and lots of exciting results. First of which will be Yuval Ishai speaking on secure computation and low complexity cryptography.
Okay, thanks a lot, and thanks to the organizers for putting together such a great program.
Actually, I think you have your own mic.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, so as the title suggests, and appropriately for a first talk, this will be a broad and not very technical, naturally biased survey talk about some complexity questions related to secure computation and the relation to other questions about complexity of cryptography. Okay, so let me start off by just first talk, so introducing the topic. So secure computation can be generally thought of as a general purpose tool for eliminating single points of failure when processing sensitive data. So we can think of the goal as being specified by some function of multiple inputs, 2 or more. And we can think of an ideal process where the inputs are handed to some trusted party. And the goal of secure computation is to dispense with this trusted party and achieve a solution where the parties interact directly with each other, where this solution is in a well-defined sense as secure as the trusted party solution with respect to a given class of attackers or adversaries. Okay, so I will sort of assume people here are familiar with the basic concepts. There have been a boot camp. I will remind you a little bit. So here is just an example of a use case of secure two-party computation in the context of ML. So we can think of ML training or ML classification. This is a classification process. And you can think of a biotech company holding some proprietary model, and a patient wants to be diagnosed based on their sensitive records. And the two parties can interact, and in the end of the interaction, the patient gets the bit that she wanted, and none of the parties learns anything else. Okay, so one nice thing about the area is that the main questions have been answered in the 1980s. We know that if there is an honest majority, we can get information theoretic security without any assumptions. And if there is no honest majority, then we can get computational security under standard cryptographic assumptions. So in some sense, this answers the high order bits. And much of the research since then, not all of it, there are still many questions on the feasibility front, but much of the research has been driven by the goal of efficiency, and there are different metrics, but the main ones that will be the center of this talk are communication, how many bits the parties send to each other, local computation, and rounds of interaction. In this talk, I will assume synchronous communication. Other talks, we'll talk about the asynchronous model. And, combined with these questions, we can also discuss what assumptions we use and whether we're interested in asymptotic versus concrete efficiency. Okay, so this is just an example of 6 combinations that can explain why there's so much research. Okay, but the nice thing about this area is that really the lines of work on theory and applied research are not disjoint, and in fact, they inform and help one another, and we'll see a lot of examples for this in the workshop. I guess that one explanation for this is that the nature of this area is that we typically are able to give some proof for something that we don't know how to break. This is not the case in all sub-areas of cryptography, but in this area, this is usually the case, especially, say, when we have an information theoretic protocol potentially relative to some ideal oracle.
Yuval, when
Yes.
you say practice, you mean what? Papers that are practical?
I meant, yeah. I did not say, I meant to say applied research, and I think I said applied research, and this is a better word. Practice is yet TBD. We all hope this will happen, but I guess that, yeah, that's definitely not, even though my affiliation is partially Amazon, I'm not a representative of practice. I am at Amazon. Okay, so the rest of the talk will be about the price of security, and by this I just mean what it sounds. So suppose that Alice and Bob want to compute some distributed function. There's a certain price without security, 1 cent, and a certain price with security. Okay, listen, this is Amazon, the price with security. This I learned at Amazon. Computation has a cost. Okay, and the goal is to minimize the overhead. Okay, and in this talk, I will really try to focus on the simplest possible questions. So I will make by default, I will also talk a little bit about others, but by default, I will think of the number of parties as being constant. In fact, throughout the talk, the number of parties is viewed as a constant, and 2 parties by default. I will consider semi-honest or honest but curious parties by default. We will talk a bit about malicious security, but this will be by default. And perhaps most importantly, we will focus mainly on optimizing one metric at a time. In many contexts, we do want to, say, optimize communication subject to constant number of rounds. So I will touch upon this in my talk, but I will mainly try to optimize one simple metric at a time. And at least my experience has been, okay, before I talk about my experience, of course there's an issue of assumptions, and I should say that we try to use standard assumptions, even minimal assumptions, or no assumptions in the information theoretic case whenever possible, but towards pushing the answers to these questions to an extreme, we are willing to make new and non-standard assumptions that will perhaps become standard in the future. Okay, that's kind of part of the deal. If you have a problem with that, you have to go out. Okay, and my experience has been that this kind of philosophy, both optimizing one metric at a time and being flexible about assumptions, leads to good things, both on the theoretical side and on the applied side. Not yet on the practical side. Okay. And specifically, there will be several interesting connections in both directions between questions about secure computation to other questions about the complexity of cryptography, typically symmetric cryptography. And again, what I will cover here is really a small sample of examples. Okay, so just a reminder from the bootcamp, if we consider two parties, semi-honest corruptions, we have the classical approach, garbled circuits, and GMW. So here we maintain the invariant that we have a 2 out of 2 secret sharing of every wire, and we use OTs to make progress. OT stands for oblivious transfer. And the downside of these approaches is that they face this communication complexity barrier, but on the bright side, they're lightweight, at least in an amortized sense. Their cost is similar to symmetric crypto. In the bottom, we have these new approaches. This is already peeling. It's already not so new. But they can break, sometimes shatter, sometimes slightly break the circuit size barrier. The downside, they use heavy crypto, and they're much slower. Okay, so typically, these are communication bound, and these will be compute bound, sometimes by big margins. Okay, and finally, there is also the information theoretic setting with an honest majority. This is taken from Peter's slides. So this is the so-called BGW template, BGW CCD template, where we use a linear secret sharing that supports multiplication. Linearity means that we can process addition gates. Now the circuit is arithmetic with additions and multiplications. We can process additions for free just by local computation. And multiplication gates can be handled with one round of interaction if we use a scheme like Shamir's scheme, and we have an honest majority. And this can be generalized to a one-round multiplication of these secrets, or if we combine with additions, computation of degree D polynomials, if we have a threshold of less than n over d corrupted parties. Okay, so this is all the reminders I will have. And now I will go through some questions that arise when we try to minimize computation, rounds, and communication, mostly separately. Okay, any questions up to this point? Okay, so when we talk about computation, this is in a sense the most problematic metric, right? Because it's very subjective, and we don't have a universal. You know, we can count bits of communication, we can count rounds. How do we count computation? And to illustrate the issue, let's consider two types of computations. This is random access to a matrix that has capital N entries, so square root n by square root n matrix. And on the right, we have a mod 2 matrix vector multiplication where the matrix is of the same size. And the question is how these two operations compare in terms of cost. Okay, I guess each of you will have a different answer. So in the RAM model, which is common in algorithms and in some branches of cryptography, now I'm being kind of conservative. This is a log-cost RAM model. This has cost logarithmic, and this has cost which is linear, so there is an exponential gap in the cost. If we look at the more complexity-oriented metric of, say, Boolean circuit size, then both have not only comparable size, but also comparable depth. So both computations can be implemented by circuits of size n and depth log n. So what is the right answer? What do you think? Is there an exponential gap, or is there no gap? Well, in theory, it depends on the model. Both models give rise to rich theory and interesting questions, but okay. So I asked my friend for some benchmarks. if these numbers do not match reality, it just means that reality is hallucinating. Okay? Anyway, I think this is kind of gives a correct. Maybe Srini, you can tell me how off this is, but.
I'm not going to contradict you.
Okay, so if you look at the CPU time, then as expected, the random access is much faster. But if you look at the GPU time, which was basically built for the purpose of this kind of computations, then the two are comparable. So maybe we can say that with time, reality is shifting more towards the circuit model. Of course, this is just one simple example, and usually things are somewhere in between. But it basically illustrates the point that when we report concrete performance, when in the applied side of the research, we should be careful about the metrics. Yes?
What about power?
Great question. I will ask my friend after the talk. But yeah, I think my sense is that from a physical perspective, this computation involves less movement of data. Even from a circuit complexity perspective, you can amortize the cost of multiple reads to the same data better. So I'm not saying they're absolutely equal, but I think that the gap is much smaller when we switch to GPU architectures. Yeah, I believe the energy for MOOCs is smaller, but I don't know this. Okay, certainly for the purpose of this talk, when I talk about computational cost, I'm referring to the circuit size. To be concrete, we're talking about Boolean circuit, the full basis of fan-in two gates. So a gate can compute XOR, NOR, any bit operation. And now we have a well-defined measure of computational overhead, which is the secure cost divided by the insecure cost for sufficiently large instances. Okay, so there's still a certain minimum problem size for this to kick in. Okay, and now we can start asking questions. And the funny thing is that these questions are rarely asked. Okay, so I will start asking questions. I also bugged some people in the last week. So let me start with the asymptotic landscape. Here we're using lambda for an exact number of bits of security, which is also a problematic notion. Talk to Daniele, he will tell you more about it. But again, it's less sensitive. The exact definition of bits of security is not so important for this slide. And we basically have, I surely forgot some central primitives, but I tried to have a taxonomy of primitives that are somewhat related to secure computation. So if you look at FHE or private information retrieval, they can be done with polylog lambda overhead. Right? This is good, right? The naive thing, you would expect it to be poly in lambda. This is just polylog lambda. Lambda is exact bits of security. You cannot play with parameters and set it to be polylog in your real level of security. Okay, and the same for snark, zero knowledge, or malicious secure two-party computation, or MPC with a constant number of parties. Symmetric primitives, and here I should stress under plausible assumptions. I will not get into the exact assumption that each of these claims is based on, but I think all of these assumptions are fairly clean and believable. We can do the symmetric crypto with a constant overhead. Somewhat more surprisingly, also semi-honest secure two-party computation can be done with constant overhead, so there is a gap here. And we can also do malicious oblivious transfer, like many instances of bit oblivious transfer. Again, n instances by a total circuit of some absolute constant times n. Okay, this is something we can do.
Since the gap is inherent?
That's a great question. I think I and quite a few others here have thought a lot about trying to close this gap. I'm pretty sure we're missing just one simple trick that nobody thought of. So I would guess that the gap will be closed. Between semi-honest and malicious. So basically, you know, if you implement, say, ZK with constant overhead, then this will close the gap. I will talk a little bit about other approaches for closing this gap, because again, we're getting pretty close, right? This is a malicious primitive, and certain tasks can be done with malicious security using this primitive. I'll talk about it. Anyway, what I wanted to mention is that this is an encrypted matrix vector product. This is a joint work with my AWS colleagues and Bocconi colleagues, which I talked about at the obfuscation workshop. The talk and the papers are online, but this is a natural reactive functionality that corresponds to uploading a matrix and then making queries of the form, I erase my state, multiply this matrix by some vector, and apply some post-processing function to the result. This corresponds to semantic search functionality. This, somewhat surprisingly, we can do with overhead 1. That's the only example I know, asymptotic overhead of 1, under some assumption that we believe in. OK. Yeah, but I should say, that's an important point, that it's not about assumptions. What I describe here captures the best heuristic construction. So there is no single example here where I know of a heuristic approach, an entirely heuristic approach that moves the problem to the left. OK, so for all we know, these are really, it's not about being happy with the assumptions. Yes?
Interesting that many of these papers are relatively old papers. So progress is slow.
It's just because it's only me working on this and I'm old. What?
You're restricting yourself to Booleans.
Yeah, in the arithmetic circuit regime, things are much better. So I think, with the exception of FHE and PIR, these two move to the left. If you are OK with arithmetic circuit over a large field where the inverse of the field size is your security level. Okay,
but why not malicious 2PC with IPS?
Yeah, also malicious 2PC you can do with IPS is problematic because it uses a super constant number of parties and you need multiplication codes, but you can just use ZK to compile. So in the arithmetic model, yeah, the situation is different. I'm focusing here on the Boolean case. It's also more challenging. Okay, any questions or counterexamples? Okay.
So,
yes.
What is the difference between large characteristic two fields and Boolean case? Is it just the circuit design or?
No, it's just that you can do, for instance, we have by now multiple ways, including some very practical ways of doing zero knowledge for arithmetic circuits over big fields, just because Schwarz-Zippel works. Okay? Otherwise, you need to do some cut and choose, some amplification. Okay. Now here's my attempt to give a concrete prediction. This is 128 bits of security. Now it's important, but it's still for sufficiently large. And nothing I say here should be quoted. This is really a wild attempt to map things. So I'm starting with FHE, kind of like a favorite thing. And FHE is definitely 10,000. How do I know? Because Shai says no idea. And when Shai says no idea, this is something you have to trust. When he says I strongly conjecture, then it's more fishy. But no idea is very reliable.
The jokes apart, 10,000 is still Boolean circuits.
Yes, I know. Daniela, you have your own estimate or somebody else? Okay, never mind. Anyway, this is for entertainment purposes. I'm not discussing EMVP because asymptotic overhead of 1 is also concrete overhead of 1, right? This is for sufficiently large instances. This is a nice, is Tianki here? This is a nice, really nice work by Fen et al. That shows that basically you can have a PRF that shrinks the input or a message authentication code where the overhead in this model is exactly 2. And moreover, 2 is tight. And the positive result just relies on the existence of a one-way function. So the core of it is just a construction of universal hash function that shrinks the input and has overhead of 2. And they also prove that 2 is optimal. So this is a rare example where we know the answer, also in terms of the assumption. Okay, AES, I'm not sure I have the right estimate. I guess that other than just dividing the number, the gate count of AES by the block length, which is what you get in terms of throughput if you want to encrypt. It's ballpark of 100. But if we rely on by now standards versions of local PRGs, then locality 4 is enough, right? If you look at the PRG where each bit is of the form A times B plus C plus D plus E, that's 4-bit operations per output. And you can bootstrap from that to even public key encryption because you do hybrid mode and so on. Right, so we have a pretty big gap, right? And you may think, well, first of all, we don't know if this is indeed translates into any realistic architecture. I think it might if you design hardware. It's just that, and this is a recurring theme, that traditional cryptography is designed to solve harder problems. They're not trying to solve large-scale version of the problem. They're trying to solve a small-scale version with optimal security, which is naturally a much harder problem. So they're not designed to optimize amortized rate, certainly not with respect to modern architectures. And you might say, AES is good enough. It's not a bottleneck in real systems. Well, it turns out, and this is another connection with secure computation, that there are quite a lot of secure computation applications that are very heavy, consume a lot of this symmetric crypto. I'm sure we'll see examples for this in this workshop. But one point I want to mention is pseudo-random secret sharing, which is a silent way of generating Shamir shares. And the number of PRG operations that you need is something like n choose t, where n is the number of parties and t is the security threshold. So if you want to push it to real systems, maybe with 10 parties, and corruption threshold of 5, then you're talking about a really huge number of PRG invocations. So, if these things are ever deployed, then maybe using better PRGs will be more motivated than for normal use cases. Okay, so this is how secure computation can even motivate the design of different symmetric primitives, even without the goal of making them MPC friendly, okay? Okay, let's switch to hash functions. SHA-256 also seems to be around 100. Again, I'm dividing now the input length, the circuit size by the input length. This is kind of the amortized cost per bit we're hashing. This is really a guesstimate that it's 10. So we have some theoretical work. Basically, my guess is that CR8 should not be much more expensive, maybe by a factor of 4, than doing an encoding of a reasonable error-correcting code, and this can be done pretty fast. Okay, but I'm not aware of anyone who even tried to address this question.
So you want just high level the gap, whatever 10-20 factor gap between this theory and practice, what is it like locally computable stuff? What is the magic?
Yes, so it's not practice, right? I mean, you could have issues about cache friendliness. There are many issues. I do not pretend to know what works in practice. I'm just saying that this primitive was designed to solve a much harder problem with respect to outdated architectures. So there is no way it's even close to optimal. This I'm sure about. I don't know whether the optimal is 10. I just know it's not close to optimal.
What I'm trying to see, is the magic locally computable? Is it the keyword that allows you for this gap? I'm trying to see what is like in theory has a potential.
So for instance, if you consider lattice-based hashing, it is sometimes faster than SHA-256. Why? Because you're not attempting to have optimal hash size in one shot, right? You're just more mildly compressing, and you're okay with having some better than brute force attacks. And you can design things that are better than lattice-based hashing. I mean, Daniele, Alon, and Chris had the practical candidate, and but they were bound to the rules of the game that were not ideal for this hash function.
Here you're talking only conditions, right? Not random oracle.
Yeah, but I mean, I would say that for Fiat Shamir purposes, we need a lot of analysis, we'll make mistakes, and here I'm interested in the truth, okay, physics. What are the limits of nature? And the only thing I'm saying for certainty is that the current standards are far from optimal. Okay, what is the optimal? I don't know. Yes?
So can't you think of this in terms of circuit depth? Meaning that in this model that your practical model you're considering, you're assuming parallelism for free. So if something can be done with reasonable serial computation, but also in parallel, then you just have to play for the depth. And hashing can be done in low depth.
Yeah. So again, I'm focusing here on circuit size, which maybe roughly corresponds to energy consumption in a very naive model. But of course, depth is also relevant. And again, the point is that whenever we have a clean question, this forces us to think of new ideas, right? So even just competing, having serious cryptanalysts compete in making progress on these problems, this will produce potentially new design ideas that will be useful in practice, right? Just the process of trying to think out of the box. Especially since we already have designs that do have, right, basically CRH design that has constant asymptotic overhead says first you expand your input using a local function, and then you apply the transpose of a good linear error correcting code, which by the transposition principle has the same circuit size as encoding. This is how it might look like. This is what the 10 estimate is based on. Okay, and I think that, there was a great workshop on proof systems, and I think that sometimes people dismiss hash-based proof systems as being less competitive because of just not using the right hash function. So I think if you get 10x speed up in hash function, I had a discussion, with Gal here and with others, also with people at the proof workshop, and nobody disagreed with this. It's just that there is no effort to do it, and there is a lot of course, in reality, you have to be compliant with standards and so on. It's not going to happen today, but I think that the effort will be very useful. Okay, SNARKs is many moving parts. So this was Ron's. This is the end of the dialogue because he asked me, okay, what is the cost of the hash function? So I said, this is on me. Okay, so this is based on my numbers for hash function. And then, okay. Okay, for semi-honest 2PC, we actually did try to optimize. This is the work, with Alet and just mentioning people who are here. And Peter, and Lisa, and I think, and anyone else I forgot? Yeah, I think these are the people who are here. Anyway, so in this work, we actually started out by optimizing the ICOS 08 construction, which is with Eyal and Rafi. And we got 100. And then we made it malicious secure with roughly 2x extra cost in the number of bit operations. So this is kind of something we sort of tried to optimize, but again, there are many degrees of freedom. Okay, yeah, so malicious OT is just roughly twice. The bound we have is roughly twice more expensive. With Peter last week, we tried to estimate normal ZK without succinctness, what is known as ZK. And we got to something slightly under 1,000. Again, many degrees of freedom, many moving parts. I think that it's a fun exercise to try to optimize this number. And malicious MPC, God knows. I mean, you can, of course, naively multiply the ZK by the semi-honest, but this will be an overestimate. Especially since we have kind of two routes towards, so about the bridging the gap, Tal's question about conjecture, I can see at least two routes for bridging the gap between semi-honest and malicious. One is based on so-called algebraic manipulation detection circuits. Mentioning people here, Manoj and Mo, and I think that's it. And the idea is that so we already have these ideal OTs, okay, which we can get with constant overhead. And now the idea is that if you run the simple semi-honest GMW protocol, then everything that a malicious adversary can do can be modeled by toggling internal wires in the circuit, right? So this protocol perfectly emulates, in the presence of malicious parties, the functionality that allows the adversary this extra degree of freedom. And then AMD circuits, they basically special model of fault-tolerant circuits that guarantee that by toggling internal wires, you cannot do more harm than if you just can toggle the inputs and outputs. And this inherently uses randomness. So we have, this is in the paper with Mo and Genkin, we have a polylog overhead for Boolean circuits. For malicious circuits, we have constant overhead, and this is another way to get from semi-honest to malicious in the arithmetic case. So if this can be improved to constant, this is one possible approach. Another approach, if you consider small functionalities, right? So even 2 out of 3 OT, that's a great open question. We do not know if it can be implemented with perfect security given ideal 1 out of 2 bit OT. Okay, we do not know. And if we do have a perfectly secure protocol, it will have constant overhead just because there is no parameter. There's nothing to depend on. Okay, so at least it will mean that in information theoretic sense, every finite functionality will have a positive rate of computation. If this problem is solved is settled in the positive, at this point, the state of the art are some partial positive result by Bar Alon and Anat Paskin-Chernyavsky.
What's AMD again?
It stands for arithmetic manipulation detection. It's a model of randomized. It's a randomized circuit such that if you toggle internal wires, you can model the input-output relation by just toggling inputs and outputs. Okay. Yeah, so these are 2 different routes for bridging this gap. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about how we get this constant overhead for semi-honest 2PC, the idea, it really can be shown as a special purpose implementation of Beaver's blueprint for non-black box OT extension. The first observation is that if I'm showing how to get general secure 2-party computation of Boolean circuits with constant computational overhead. So it's really about asking what can we easily do with constant computational overhead. So an easy task is doing a single instance of a long string OT because we can use the standard hybrid encryption trick where we do OT of keys of symmetric encryption, and then we use a constant overhead symmetric encryption to encrypt the 2 strings. Okay, so this handles one functionality of long string OT. And now we want to reduce the general computation to long string OTs, which doesn't sound like it's doable, right? String OT is sort of boring, and a general computation does a lot of interesting things. And the second step is to observe that if we have an unbalanced NC0 functionality, which means that one party's input is polynomially bigger than the other party's input, and this functionality is in NC0 in the sense that the big input, every bit, this is the output of the functionality, and this is the shorter input. Okay, so if every bit of the output depends on a constant number of bits of the shorter input, then we can apply information theoretic garbling, because garbling will basically apply to every output bit separately. And if we use an information theoretic version of Yao's garbled circuit to a constant side function, this will have a constant overhead, just because we use one-time pads instead of cryptographic keys. Okay, so this basically handles any unbalanced NC0 functionality. And now we define such a functionality which basically does many bit oblivious transfers, but where one of the parties' input is chosen from a short seed, and this makes the functionality unbalanced and allows us to use once we have many bit OTs, we can use the GMW protocol, which has a constant overhead. Okay, so this is really how to get this constant overhead result for 2PC. Yeah, I should mention that really it's kind of unique, because we don't have a real substitute for a local PRG. There is some recent paper of Benny and others that bases it on other assumptions, but they're closely related to a local polynomial stretch PRG. And even, the celebrated JLS result that builds I/O from where one of the assumptions is local PRG, it's not our only route towards I/O. And here, this is the only route we know. So all of the known constructions, including heuristic ones, rely on some object which is similar to a local PRG. So in a sense, when Oded Goldach wrote his paper suggesting this one-way function, it seemed like an esoteric direction, not like something that will be crucial for some natural application. Okay, my time is limited, so maybe I'll shorten a bit. So let's switch from computation to rounds. Trying to minimize the number of round trips of this poor pigeon. This is how things, secure computation was done. Speaking of practical, it used to be practical, but now, okay. Yeah, so there's been a lot of action in this area, and there is a common perception, I guess we'll hear about it also in talks, that basically all of the questions, if we don't care about communication, but only about rounds, it seems like, and semi-honest, right? I'm talking about semi-honest, that all questions that involve just round complexity for semi-honest secure computation are solved. Okay, even people who work in the area, even I am sometimes under this impression. But let's see. So this is really, there were these breakthrough results from 2018 by Garg and Srinivasan and by Ben Hamuda and Lin that finally settled the question of two-round dishonest majority MPC from the minimal assumption, which is the existence of two-message oblivious transfer protocol. This OT protocol is used somewhat surprisingly in a non-black box way. The approach is really to garble a protocol that uses it, sort of like a snark composition or FHE bootstrapping. And in fact, we showed that this non-black box use of oblivious transfer is necessary. And then Arpita and Akshay showed that if you add one more round, then you can make a black box use, but of an OT protocol, not of an OT oracle. So that's another interesting example where, even a black box use of a computational protocol gives you more power than just an oracle. Okay, so this seems pretty much to answer everything. And again, I'm focusing here on an arbitrary number of corrupted parties for the computational setting. In the information theoretic setting, again, following this breakthrough, there were other results, also some old results which were improved. But basically, we know that two rounds are necessary and sufficient. Also, the threshold is optimal, just t less than n over 2. And if we are given a common setup, which is pairwise OT correlations, then we can have two-round protocol information theoretic with dishonest majority, which is also optimal. Okay, so it seems like everything is closed, but there are actually at least two types of open questions, again, even if we ignore concrete efficiency questions. So first of all, these protocols are only polynomial time if the functions are simple in relatively low complexity classes. I'll talk about that. And second, and this is less commonly known, these results do not cover all useful settings of interaction that are allowed in two-round MPC. Okay, so this is a so-called client-server model, which seems pretty realistic. You have clients, M clients of which TC can be corrupted by the adversary. Again, passive adversary. They each send one message to the server, to each server, and then each server can send one message to an evaluator. Sometimes the evaluators are the clients themselves. This is kind of a stronger model in the sense of feasibility results in this model can be translated to the standard model. In the converse direction, we don't know. Okay? So in the computational setting, things are almost settled, except for this funny case. So here, if we make a non-black box use of two-round oblivious transfer, which is a necessary assumption, we can get the best security, right? Any number of clients and servers, the evaluator can be corrupted. The evaluator, we assume it can also always be corrupted. But if we assume that the clients are kind of like send their messages and erase their state or destroy themselves, and we just consider a collusion of evaluator and the servers, then the question becomes more tricky. And we know that this can be done from public key encryption, or actually we knew, and now there is a very recent result showing that this can also be done unconditionally. Okay, so this moves to the bottom part. And this is a result by Bitansky, by Saroja, who is here, and by Rachit Garg. Okay, so in the information theoretic setting, again, this moved to the information theoretic setting, but even without this special case, we have this situation where we have a trade-off between the number of corrupted clients and the number of corrupted servers. Okay, so in a sense here, we still don't understand the real picture. Okay, yes?
Isn't it inherent that it's fully 2 rounds, or is there some kind of like pre-processing?
No. So this is no pre-processing. This is all the setup. The clients don't need to know each other. No setup. And again, what we would have liked, this would have been the best. The best result is a protocol that resists any number of corrupted clients and PS less than n over 2 servers. Okay? We can only get, if we want any number of clients to be corrupted, we can only get 1/3 corrupted servers. And if we insist on 1/2 corrupted servers, which is optimal in the information theoretic setting, we can only get 2/3. That's a funny result with Benny and Arpita and Or. Which gets this result. If the evaluator is one of the clients, then this equality can be made weak. Okay, so this is the situation. And yeah, I guess I'll be very brief here, but I just want to highlight, and now I'm going back to all this. Now I'm saying let's forget everything we know about the round complexity of MPC and think from first principles. How do we get around this problem? So our natural tendency when we face a complex problem is to try to solve it by complex tools, and a dual approach, which often, at least in this domain, works better, is to ask, which task is easy, okay, for the given setup, and then can we reduce a general task to the easy task? Okay, so this approach, to just give an example of the easy task. So this is the example of having a protocol between Alice and Bob that invokes parallel oblivious transfers, which can be compiled using 2-message OT into a 2-message protocol. So here, the task becomes very easy if each output of the function depends on only 1 bit of Alice, which will be the selection of Alice, and then it can depend arbitrarily on the input of Bob and also randomness of Bob. So this looks like garbling, and it is garbling. But you can just think about it as a class of functions, a function that takes an input from Alice, an input from Bob, and randomness from Bob, and every bit of the output depends on at most 1 bit of Alice. How do we call the part of the output that depends on 0 bits of Alice? Garbled circuit. Okay? Good. In this client-server MPC example, as I showed in the beginning in the reminder about honest majority MPC, the Peter slide, we can handle degree D polynomials if the server corruption threshold is T less than N over D. Okay, just the BGW style protocol will work. Okay, so now the natural question is how to do the reduction, and this reduction from general functions or sort of general functions to simple functions is captured by the notion of randomized encoding of functions, which basically says, hey, I have a general function f that I want to compute, but it's not easy enough for me, no matter what my goal is. I don't like this f. I want to replace it by another g. So you can think, okay, let's try to encode the output of F and just have G output such an encoding, but this is stupid. Okay? If you think of a deterministic encoding for a second, you'll realize this is stupid. It will not make things any easier. Think of Y, which is 1 bit. How do you encode 1 bit deterministically? Okay, so instead, we just add randomness, and we require that this G, which now takes both an input and a random input, has an output distribution that corresponds exactly to the output of F, so you can go back and forth. You can decode from this, and you can simulate from Y this encoding without knowing the input. Okay, and this is really a non-trivial relaxation of computing because F itself is a randomized encoding of F, kind of a trivial case. And by allowing this extra degree of freedom, we're just opening many extra possibilities, and the hope we can make this notion either information theoretic or computation. I will refer to the information theoretic notion by default, but there are also interesting open questions about the computational notion. And the hope is that G indeed can be significantly simpler than F for the given goal, right? Either a low-degree function or decomposable function of the form of the two-party example, and so on. Okay, and it turned out, and this is kind of a detour, that just this abstraction and then plugging in techniques that were developed in the context of secure computation helped settle a major open problem about the complexity of cryptography. So it was open for many years, and people asked the question, can we implement basic cryptographic primitives like a one-way function, encryption, and so on, in the complexity class NC0, namely every bit of the output depends on a constant number of input bits. Here, this is a function with locality 3. Okay, and it turns out that if you apply this randomized encoding to your favorite cryptographic function, say one-way function, the encoded function, when you view it as a deterministic function of the input and the randomness, will also be a one-way function, and we can say the same for many other crypto primitives. So you can think of this randomized encoding compiler as kind of a steamroller that takes some fairly complex implementation of the primitive, say one-way function, and gives you a flat one in NC0. And this works generally, and this can be based on essentially all standard cryptographic assumptions. Okay, so I should say that there are exceptions. We cannot have pseudo-random functions in NC0. We cannot have reconstruction of a secret sharing scheme. We cannot have decryption in NC0. For these questions, for these primitives, there are interesting questions of how low they can be pushed, but not to NC0.
Are there
Yes?
primitives that we don't know how to do, but might be possible? But we just don't know?
Great question. I don't know of such examples. I don't recall such example.
What about secret sharing encoding?
Secret sharing encoding can be done because randomized encoding can be applied to secret sharing encoding. We can have, in fact, secret sharing where sharing is in NC0 and reconstruction is in AC0 if you're okay with the gap threshold. Sharp threshold reconstruction in AC0 is a great open question.
I was also asking error correcting codes, but error correcting codes we don't know in NC.
Error correcting codes, they cannot. It depends on the parameters, but they cannot be in NC0 because then the input locality, and a good error correcting code cannot have small input locality, and by counting. Okay, so really the theorem we proved with Eyal and Benny, which was imported from previous works that were entirely motivated by the round complexity or just doing secure computation, is really that we can take every moderately easy function and compile it into a function with constant locality. And to be precise, the output locality is 4, so every output bit depends on 4 bits. The algebraic degree is 3 in both the input. Both measures refer to the input combined with the randomness because this is important for some applications, also for MPC. And the locality 1 is x, which is what you need for garbling. Okay, so this is kind of simultaneously meeting all useful properties. And what is it useful for? Locality 4 is great because it gives us 4 local cryptography, right? The one-way function or the encryption scheme has this super parallel, two depth 2 in the Boolean circuit model. We can get a 2-round information theoretic MPC with T less than n/3. Sounds suboptimal, but it's still, okay, I will get to it later. But, and this gives us information theoretic garbling or 2PC with parallel OT. Okay, so I should say that this is still the best known in the client-server model where any number of parties can be corrupted. Okay, but it became obsolete in the standard. It was subsumed by better results in the standard model. I will explain why this notion of randomized encoding is a bit, in retrospect, too restrictive for the application to secure computation. Okay, what does moderately easy mean? So, you know, we had, this is something you can get from a careful implementation of Yau's construction, NC1, like exponential in the depth of the circuit. But if you're more, you know, you're more creative, and this was something that we proved in subsequent papers, you can get to higher complexity classes. In particular, you can be polynomial in the branching program size. And we and I always used to be dismissive about the distinction. This is kind of like complexity theory geeks, and NC1 is good enough for everything, right? We can build public encryption in NC1, PRFs in NC1. Why do we care beyond NC1? And we keep saying NC1 when we mean to say moderately easy. Okay? I think everybody, present company included. However, you know, there's something really exciting that happened recently. This is a breakthrough result of Williams, who showed that every circuit of size S can be simulated non-trivially, right? The trivial simulation is 2 to the S by a branching program of size 2 to the square root of S. And as Benny pointed out to me, this effectively means that we don't need a one-way function to be log depth. We just need it to be practical in the sense that its security is sort of close to optimal, and not too big in the sense that the circuit size is less than quadratic in the input size. Okay, so any practical design, if you generalize it, even if it's not in NC1, will satisfy it. So effectively, the result of Ryan Williams suggests that we can go much beyond the log depth designs to compile. And I feel like this kind of results can actually lead to some dramatic results like bootstrapping, like FHE from other assumptions and so on. So yeah, it's not that I see, if I saw how to do it, I would not be saying this, but but if one of you, you know, if you do it, then you have to remember who said it first. Okay. Yeah, and if we settled for computationally secure randomized encoding, we can get really such a compiler for all polytime functions, but this does require, this is not unconditional. We do need a moderately easy one-way function. And this actually has some surprising consequences, like a non-black box NC0 construction of signatures using a one-way permutation. So you take the code of a one-way permutation, it can be arbitrarily complex, and you use it to design an NC0 circuit that uses the permutations in Oracle to sign. Never mind that, it's too complicated. I'm just saying that even this computational randomized encoding, this is not kind of a plug-and-play result from Yao. This requires a bit of care, and this also has applications. Anyway, yeah, also something else I want to say about computational randomized encoding, that there have been recent practical applied papers on constant round MPC with many parties that try to beat this so-called Beaver-Micali-Rogaway protocol that makes a black box use of a pseudo-random generator but incurs some overhead which scales linearly in the number of parties. And the way to do it is by using some, I would say, MPC-friendly or garbling-friendly pseudo-random generators or pseudo-random functions. So potentially, progress on this front can lead to more practical constant round MPC protocols with many parties. Okay, beyond what normal garbling techniques give us. Because this approach can be distributed easily because of low algebraic degree. Okay, there are quite a few open questions, and I'll just flash them quickly. Perhaps the biggest one is, can we get unconditionally, NC0 information theoretic encodings for all polytime functions? For MPC, this means major open problem was asked, from the early 90s or late 80s. Do we have constant round protocols efficient for every polytime function? We don't know. In the context of low complexity crypto, this means, does every one-way function imply one-way function in NC0? We're a bit closer to that because of Williams' result, but still quite far. Degree 2 for every function. We can rule it out with perfect security, but with statistical security, it's open. We have a simple complete function like x1, x2, x3 plus x4. If you can have a degree 2 encoding of this, you have degree 2 encoding for all functions. It's a nasty problem. A positive result would settle the result in the client-server model and will also give us a general compiler of locality 3. 2 is impossible, so locality 3 is optimal. Okay, and finally, we can ask complexity questions about the size of encodings and so on, which are relevant both to constant round MPC and hypothetically to applied computer hardware, as opposed to theoretical. Okay, and just a few words, the idea for breaking the degree 3 barrier due to Applebaum, Brakersky, and Sabari this is kind of a clean abstraction, is really to observe that this randomized encoding abstraction doesn't take the distributed nature of the problem into account, and in MPC, the parties can locally process their inputs in a way that's not bounded by the degree. And just to, so this enables degree 2 randomized encoding with this preprocessing, which is referred to as multi-party randomized encoding. You need some collusion resistance for this to be useful in MPC. And there is an alternative notion that only doesn't consider corrupted clients, and this is the notion of additive randomized encoding, recent notion with Ishai, Eyal, and Tal. And there we can have even degree 1 encoding, but this assumes there are no corrupted clients. And just a word about why every function has degree 2 multi-party randomized encoding. A brute force way of achieving this is to just guess a transcript of an honest majority protocol and then check consistency, sort of like an MPC in the head on steroids, but with tiny success probability. And it turns out that this consistency check can be done by degree 2 normal randomized encoding. It's an AND of equalities, and equalities are degree 1. You can do XOR, and basically that's a simple way to see that every function has degree 2 randomized encoding. So yeah, the final part, which I will not get to, is minimizing communication. I should just say that we'll hear a lot about it in later talks today about succinct garbling. We have fully homomorphic encryption, which gives us almost everything, almost because this is restricted to short output. With long outputs, we still need I/O. And for malicious security, this is a result of Hubacek and Wicks. We have HSS, which gives us a good level of succinctness, a lot of active research that we'll hear about to understand under which assumptions we can get HSS. And if we want slightly sublinear computation, we can even do it with other assumptions and with more practical efficiency, and we'll hear more about this. So let me skip to the end. Yes, I wanted to tell you about one more thing, which is pseudo-random, which is kind of a work from last crypto with Alet and others, where we try to find a sweet spot, at least in the honest majority setting. If you have strong honest majority, we can get slightly sublinear secure computation using only symmetric cryptography, or special kind of symmetric cryptography, which is local PRGs over large alphabets that were considered and dismissed in the context of obfuscation, but they can have a comeback in the context of MPC. So let me conclude. So we still have a long way to go, even in the simplest models of secure computation. Obviously, we have a lot more in more complex and demanding models. This motivates complexity questions that were not a priori expected, like questions about randomizing encodings of functions, questions about low complexity symmetric cryptography. I did not discuss a line of research which I find very interesting about figuring out the complexity of pseudo-random functions, which is also relevant for distributing symmetric cryptography. Sparse pseudo-random generator is a notion related to the last topic of getting cheap, slightly sublinear secure computation. And I would highlight 3 open questions that are very concrete. Malicious security with constant overhead. That's kind of a binary challenge. Either you get it or not. This one is almost certainly possible to make progress. I mentioned 100 as a rough estimate for the concrete overhead we have for semi-honest secure 2PC. There are many moving parts. This can almost surely be improved. Or base it on other assumptions that are not related to local PRG. And finally, efficient constant round information theoretic MPC, a big, long-standing open problem, and practical sublinear communication, which we'll hear about more later today in talks by Zhao and by Rachel and possibly by David. Okay, so that's it.
Predictions you'd like to hear?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if that's the case, then we have a break now.